Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this incredible lecture by Harriet Welty Rochefort. My name is Renee Amory Ketchum, and I'm a member of the AFUSA Federation Board of Directors in charge of cultural offerings, as well as president of the Alliance Françaises of Greenwich. Today, we have the honor of welcoming Harriet Welty Rochefort to share her first novel, Final Transgression, One Woman's Tragic Destiny in War-Torn France. The format will be an interview of Harriet with visuals by Harriet's promotional assistant, Maggie Mixon. Now, we have a couple of housekeeping details to put up on the screen just to facilitate the program that Harry's going to. So again, please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. Keep your options set to speaker, not gallery, and feel free to enter comments and questions in the chat. We'll probably do 30 minutes of Q&A with Maggie and Harriet, and then we'll run the Q&A from the chat. So just a few words of introduction. I think we have all the housekeeping up on screen. Harriet Welty Rochefort is an author, freelance journalist, teacher, speaker, and true Francophile. She grew up in Shenandoah, Iowa, and was educated in the Midwest, having received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Michigan and MSJ from Northwestern Medill School of Journalism. A French-American dual citizen, she has lived in France since 1973 with her French husband, Philippe. They have 3 sons and 6 grandchildren. Harriet has a wonderful story of her arrival and subsequent life in France that I'm hoping one of you who's listening now, member of the audience, will ask her about in a Q&A. How she got to France is a whole different story, so it's worth savoring at the end of the conversation. Harriet is well known for her 3 humorous but informative nonfiction books about her life in France and the cultural differences she has perceived as an American embedded in France. French Toast, her books, French Toast, French Fried, and Joie de Vivre are all gold standards of books about the French, celebrating the maddening mysteries of the French whining and dining, and the French penchant for enjoying life with style and panache. In addition, Harriet is a freelance journalist, having worked for many international publications, including Time Magazine, where she worked for 10 years. She has also taught a reporting course at Institut d'études politiques de Paris, Sciences Po, and has lectured all over the US and France. A true Francophile, Harriet knows France well and claims to be one of the only Americans to have visited every one of its 13 regions. Final Transgression, One Woman's Tragic Destiny in War-Torn France is Harriet's first novel. Inspired by true events that took place in the seething cauldron of Southwest France 3 months prior to the D-Day victory and the tragedy of Oradour-sur-Glane, Final Transgression was published in May of 2020. I just wanted to take a moment to give you, for those who have not read the book, a brief synopsis. 2 sisters, 2 lives. In Final Transgression, 85-year-old Caroline Aubry tells the tale of the tragic wartime destiny of her beloved younger sister, Séverine. From their humble beginnings in a hamlet in the southwest of France to a castle where Séverine becomes the protege of the beautiful countess who employs their parents, their trajectories differ. After the family moves to Paris, the pragmatic Caroline becomes a successful designer, and the high-spirited Séverine marries a rich jeweler. When World War II breaks out and her collaborationist husband betrays her, the headstrong Séverine flees to the castle and the countess, in spite of warnings about the risks of traveling to an area that is a fierce battleground for rival groups of resistors, Nazis, and collaborators. Séverine is beautiful and intelligent, but obstinate and unaware, 2 traits that in wartime will ultimately seal her fate. The end of the war in France was a time for settling scores. Séverine, an ordinary woman living in extraordinary times, unwittingly hands the hangman's noose to her enemies in one egregious act, her final transgression. Robert Paxton, eminent American political scientist and historian specializing in Vichy France, gave an extraordinary endorsement of the novel, calling it, and I quote, historically well-grounded and a vigorous and compelling tale. I am honored to welcome Harriet Welty Rochefort and Maggie Mixon. Je vous donne la parole.
Merci, Renee. Thank you very much. I don't know if these things will disappear from my screen because I don't seem to be on speaker view anymore. Ah, here we go. Okay. There we go. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you. I'm on this gallery and I can see some of you and say hello. But then I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch back to speaker because I'll get distracted. I want to talk to each and every one of you separately. I can't do that. So I'll start in going back to speaker view. And I want to thank the Alliance Française USA for inviting me to speak. I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to see so many people I know from all over the States and maybe elsewhere. And so tonight, Maggie Mexon, my promotional assistant and brilliant young woman, is going to do a little Q&A with me so that I can present my book in a kind of a lively fashion. And then we will have a few slides, a few visuals, and we'll move on to your questions, which of course will be very interesting. You might, when you ask your questions, I might ask you if you've read the book or not, because questions, are very different depending on if you've read the book or if it's just pre-reading the book. Okay, so thank you again. And Maggie, would you like to start?
Yes, well, first of all, like you said, thank you to the Alliance Française for having us. My first question for you, Harriet, actually has to do with your previous books, French Toast, French Fried, and Joie de Vivre. They were all very light-hearted nonfiction books. And you kind of made this very extreme turn to fiction, to a very dark tale. For those of you who have not seen her 3 previous books, they're the cover. So I'm curious, what was this transition like for you? Because you really kind of did a 180 with your writing style.
I certainly did. You are absolutely right. Well, as you can see from the covers and comparing those covers to this cover, it is a real change. I wrote those 3 books because I'm absolutely fascinated by the French. Why am I fascinated by the French? It's a story that goes way back to when I was 8 years old in Iowa, and my grandmother died, and my grandpa married a lovely woman who was a professor of French at Grinnell College, which is a college maybe some of you know. It's a very fine liberal arts college in Iowa. And she had taught French, and she had gone to France to live. And she taught me all these little words, like I learned at the age of 8 that a fork was a fourchette, and that a pig, of which we have many in Iowa, are cochon. And I thought this was just so terribly exotic. And so from the time I was 8, I had one goal in life, and that was to go to France. And I will tell the rest of that story later on at the end of this meeting, because if not, you'll never have time for everything. But long story short, I came to France and I married a Frenchman. And this first book, French Toast, that you see, was a book that had to be, it was a story that had to be told. It was about an American in Paris. What does it say? Celebrating the maddening mysteries of the French. The American in Paris is me, and it's me telling, I kind of wrote it as a way of telling my mother what living in France was really like. And so I took down everything that I didn't understand about the French, of which there were many things, and it became a book. And that was a little book that nobody wanted that book at the time because they were all enamored of Peter Mayle. And so finally it made its way, and it's been out there for a long time, since 1997 actually, and it's still there, it's still going strong. So the 3 books are indeed light-hearted and humorous. I had a great time writing them. I could have continued to write probably a book a year about some aspect of the French, because I'm so fascinated by how different everything is here. But a story presented itself to me, and I'll tell you about that later, and it could only be told through fiction. And it was one of these stories that I had to write. It was like my first book, French Toast. That was something I had to write. This one was too. So that's the kind of brief answer to the switch.
In this story that presented itself to you, it takes place in World War II, as we know. And as many of us have probably seen in any bookstore, there's just been an onslaught of historical fiction about World War II, and largely with female protagonists lately. So I'm curious about what makes Final Transgression different in terms
Yes,
of all the other books we've seen.
well, excuse me, I have a whole bunch of books here, so I was going to give some examples. But many of these books, I read a lot of them. Many of the fiction books about France and women during the war are written by Americans or English people or etc. like me. But they always seem to feature an American or a British spy or someone who comes from elsewhere into France. And we get the point of view of that person. And I wanted to write a story, and the story that presented itself to me was a story that takes place in France among French people. There are no Americans, Brits, Australian in my story. I thought that was already one point that is rather original. The other original point is that the woman protagonist of the story is what I call an ordinary woman. She wasn't Jewish. She wasn't a resistant. She wasn't a collaborator. She was just a young woman trying to get by, get through the war. And so that's something that is a little bit unusual too. And the third really unusual point is that this takes place in France at a period of time in the war that most non-French don't know about. And that is a period called the Épuration Sauvage, the wild purges at the end of the war, as the tide was turning and the resistants could see that they were going to win, that France was going to, be delivered from the yoke of the Nazis. And there was a lot of score settling going on. It was a terrible period. And it was a period in which Séverine is told not to go back to her hometown in the southwest of France, in Périgord, because of what is going on, this very explosive situation, which I can tell you about a little later on when we have some slides. So those were the three main points, which are different than most of the stories that I personally have read.
And Severine's this extremely dynamic character, and she has this very particular journey. So I know a lot of people have wondered, is this based on a true story? What inspired you to feel called by this character, Séverine?
Yes, it's absolutely based on a true story. It's based on the true story of my husband, my French husband's aunt. And I discovered this true story one day when we were out in my in-laws' country home outside of Paris. And I walked in my mother-in-law's bedroom, which I knew very well because I knew the whole house very well. And on the mantle, I saw a mantle of the fireplace. I saw a picture of a young woman who was very beautiful and who was dressed in 1940s clothes with a 1940s hairstyle. And I said, oh, who is that beautiful woman? And she said, that's my sister. And I said, oh, well, what happened to her? I'd never heard her speak of her. I said, what happened to her? And she said she died during the war. And those were just the two phrases that she said, and that was it. And since I'm a journalist and since I always have my antenna out, I said, there's something more to that story. And I'm going to find out what it was, what it is. So I asked my husband and he said, well, I don't know. I don't know what happened. We just never talked about that. So the antenna gets even more. And I said, oh no, I will not ask my mother-in-law, because in France, there are nuances in the tone of voice. And there's a way of communicating that you don't want to talk about the subject. So I was never going to talk to her about it ever. I didn't want to broach it with her. So I tried. I just, did this and that. Nothing happened really. And then one day we were at the 50th wedding anniversary of my in-laws at their apartment in Paris, which the living room wasn't all that big. And one of their elderly gentlemen friends started talking to me. And we just talked about this and that. And then he looked at me and he said, well, that was really bad business about, and he mentioned the name of the sister. And I said, okay, now I'm going to hear it. And I'm really excited. And at the same time, because I always have one eye and one ear someplace and another someplace else, at the same time, I looked across the room and I saw the distance at which my mother-in-law and father-in-law were standing from me. And I heard the volume of the voice of the elderly gentleman, which was very loud because he was rather deaf. And I put two and two together and I said, I just can't do that. And so I changed the subject. And I said, okay, once again, it slipped by me. I'm never going to hear this story. So that made me even more motivated. I began my own research. I said to Philippe, let's go down to the Périgord where this happened. And so we did. And we started investigating the story. I became more and more fascinated. And I started putting things together and started creating a fictional story out of what we learned down there. I can tell you, I keep saying I'm going to tell you things later, but I'm trying to move this along. And what I don't tell you now, I will tell you later. So don't worry. I will tell you later about the precise research that we did down there and how that became the backbone for the fictional story. Yeah.
So you couldn't talk to your in-laws about what happened exactly to the character whom Severine is based off of, but you have told me that you talked to them a lot about the war and specifically the Nazi occupation of France. So what kind of things did they tell you about that time in France?
Well, they told me about, I think, yes, you've got some slides here. And I'm not going to give you a history of France under the occupation. Don't worry. I'll go through these slides because they mean something in the context of the story. So they told me about the humiliation that the French felt when their country was occupied. And I don't know if any of you present have seen this rather famous picture of this gentleman and his expression of étonnement. He's stunned, he's appalled, he's aghast as he watches his country being taken over by the enemy. It's just such a powerful picture that I had to show it because it's just the picture of humiliation itself. And of course, you see on the other side the German troops marching down the Champs-Élysées. So they didn't tell me about the humiliation in that many words, but there was that humiliation, of course. So we can go on to the next one. There was deprivation. My mother-in-law told me many stories about the rations and about, everything. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough coal to heat the houses. There wasn't enough material for clothes. Women walked around in high heels with cork soles. So it was a difficult time, to say the least. And it's an example. Normally, an adult needs 2,000 calories a day, let's say, to keep the little machine running. And during the war, the French had 1,200 calories. So they were at the very bottom of the what is needed, the requirement. So people say the French are obsessed by food these days. Maybe there's a reason for it. It stems from the war. I don't know. My mother-in-law told me stories about the cat and the rabbit. I call it the cat and the rabbit story. My mother-in-law ate, she was a wonderful cook and a wonderful hostess, and she ate everything herself. Never did I see her turn away something and say, oh no, I don't eat this or that, except for rabbit. She told me, after the war, I just could never bring myself to eat rabbit. And the French eat rabbit a lot. And she said, the reason is that during the war, sometimes you would buy a rabbit, the head would be off. And actually it was a cat. And so she said, it stayed with me to this day. I just can't do that. So there were stories, anecdotes about that. She told me about curfews and the risk of breaking the curfew. I'll just back up here, just the curfews. We have curfews now for COVID. But the difference is during the war, if you broke the curfew, which my in-laws did, they were bored. I mean, they were bored. They were never bored, but they wanted to go and play bridge at the neighbor's house. And the Germans were patrolling the bridge right in front of the house. And so they would sneak off in the pitch black of the night over to the neighbor's house with all the curtains drawn. And they would have a nice game of bridge and then come back home. And she said, but the problem is, if that day a German soldier had been shot or something, or there'd been some kind of an attack, and you happen to have been thrown in jail because you were caught breaking the curfew, it was very bad, because then the Germans might come and try, and they might come and into the jails and take people hostage, and then you yourself would be shot for something as stupid as going to play bridge at a neighbor's house. So what I mean by that is that there were a lot of risks that people took, and that the price to pay was very high, and you had to be careful. And Séverine was not careful. She was not a careful person. She was a flighty person, and she learned, and unfortunately she didn't learn to be careful. But also now here we are, we're in a German country too. So when Séverine walked down the street, what did she see? She saw road signs in German, and she saw posters saying that your family would be really happy if they would go to work in Germany, and that you'd all feel better if you put your trust in the German soldier. So here we are living in this very overtaken land, and it was a real challenge for everyone. We could go on to the next. Then, well, then the worst happened, which happened very quickly. Hitler shook hands with Marshal Pétain shook hands with Hitler, and there came on the collaborationist government. I read somewhere that Marshal Pétain's justification for doing that was that he thought he would get a better deal for the French by being able to collaborate with the Germans, which was absolutely not true. It became a puppet government, and it brought about some terrible things, including the statue of the Jewish people, in which they were forbidden to go, to be in the army, the press, have businesses. My own father-in-law, who was not Jewish, had to go back, it was 3 or 5, I don't remember, generations, because he was a business owner, and he had to prove that he wasn't Jewish. So, this was the France that people were living in. And this, I just put that poster there, the exhibition of the Jew in France, because in my book, I have a scene in which 2 of my characters are inside of that exhibition. And I won't tell you more about it because you'll have to read the book. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. So what do you do when your country's occupied? Well, do you resist or do you collaborate? Do you resist? Do you join the Maquis? Or do you join the milice over here? These people with these floppy berets here are the milice, and the dreaded milice, because they were the French people who had decided to collaborate with the Vichy government and, of course, the Germans. And so what is interesting about that is that the resistants were fighting not only the Nazis, but they were fighting the milice too. So that made a lot of fighting, triangular fighting. And that was one of the reasons that Séverine was told not to go down to that area of France, the southwest of France, because that's where that fighting was the heaviest. And she went anyway, okay? And once again, she wasn't being careful. She wasn't thinking, okay. So the score settling at the end of the war, I believe you've seen this famous photo by Robert Capa. You see the lady in there, the woman holding the baby, and she is being paraded through the streets of Chartres, where the beautiful cathedral is. This is in Chartres, 1944. And people are jeering, laughing, making fun of her. And, they were just kind of expiating for maybe things that they themselves had do it. They were happy somebody else was suffering because they weren't. And who knows what they did during the war. So there was worse than that, which was because at least she got out with her life, this head shaven woman. But there were 10,000 people who were killed without trial. They were killed in acts of summary justice at the end of the war, which is something, I don't know if you knew that, but I didn't, certainly. And it was a very shocking thing for me to learn, at least. So that is it for the war. The book is not only about the war, but of course the book ends with the war, and Severine's destiny would never have happened had there not been the war. So I felt like I had to kind of put those slides up to give you the context. But we could go back now to the book and the process of writing and all these other points that we want to talk about.
Yes, well, before you even get to the war in the book, it's a period in the book that you label Paradise Lost. But before then, you have Paradise and the Paradise Years. So I am curious why you felt the need to label them as such and what that really signifies about Severine's journey.
Okay. Severine Severine and her sister grew up in a little hamlet. And then one day, Severine's grandmother dies, and her sister is trying to console her. And that day, she says, "Well, we are going to move to we will soon be in paradise." And so the little Severine says, "Oh, you mean we're going to die too, like Mémé?" And she says, "No, we're not going to die. We really are moving to a place that is paradise. Papa learned today that he's been employed as a caretaker at the castle in the next village over." And so Severine, ever since that day, for her, paradise was that place they moved to. And well, I might just read you that little teeny part, because it shows it more clearly. So, "We are leaving the castle," Caroline said. "Mama and Papa have been hired to work at the castle in Sorignac. They told me today it's just like paradise." She began describing Sorignac. "The streets were lined with gold," she told her sister. "The countess was a beautiful and benevolent queen, and the castle was like something straight out of their fairy tale books. Best of all," she said, "they would live in their very own cottage, in a room of their own under a sloping thatched roof." Severine didn't believe a word about the gold-lined streets or the benevolent queen. She knew for a fact that she would rather have a living, breathing Mémé than an absent Mémé looking down at them from heaven. But she sensed that the part about the cottage was true, and also especially liked the idea of sharing a bedroom with her sister. Severine was capable of fantasy, to be sure, but she was also logical. Without Mémé, their tiny three-room house was no longer home. So they do move to paradise, and that's why the first part of the book is called Paradise, because for her, it was a kind of a paradise. And then the second part of my book is called The Paris Years, because the family moves to Paris. And then the third section of the book is called Paradise Lost, because Severine chooses to go back to her paradise. She saw it as a refuge, and it was paradise lost at that point, for reasons I will not tell, because I don't want to divulge the end of the book.
And so when Severine gets into paradise, when they move to the castle to work for the countess, it kind of starts to bring in this theme in the book of class relations. Severine is taken under the wing of this benevolent countess, but then we also see her marry very wealthy. So you kind of bring this thread throughout the book. How would you say social classes are still thought of in France? Are they still as rigid as they were during the times of the book, or have things developed?
I don't know if you'd say, I think there's an expression in France that is plus ça change. The more things change, the more they don't change. The French cut off the head of Louis XVI so they could, have their liberté, fraternité, and égalité. But still today, the French seem to want to look up, not to the king, because there is no more king, but to look up to the president, to look up to this person at the top of the nation who's going to make the decisions. It's a very top-down society. Maybe that's a reason they're always in the streets demonstrating, because it's not a consensual society. So yes, yeah. And it's very interesting because some sociologists have written about the French that it's a society in which who you are is more important than what you do. So even me, when I meet a French person, I'm always saying to my French husband, who is that person? Which is an interesting question. I don't say, what does that person do? I don't care. I guess I've become French. I say, who is that person? And by that, I mean, who is their family? Where did they come from? Is it an old family? Is it maybe politically too? It's just this thing that is very French. So yes, there are still aristocrats. There's still the bourgeoisie. There's still the working class. There's still the capitalists who are against the communists. It all plays out the way it has throughout French history in my mind. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And so your French husband, who tends to be your advisor on all things France, you've told me before that when you were researching this book, you went with him to do a lot of the research that is kind of at the foundation of the story, and you went down specifically to the Périgord where the action of the story takes place.
Yes.
What was that like, and how did you conduct your research? Also, did anything really surprise you about what you found?
Well, as a former reporter, I'm used to sticking my nose in probably in things I shouldn't. But yeah, I basically followed reporting techniques. I went to the place. Oh, by the way, my research, I did it all by myself with my husband. I didn't have a research. Maggie is my promotional assistant, but I did not have a research assistant. I want to do the research myself because that way I own it. So what I see, what I find out, it becomes mine and I soak it up. That's very important to me. So we went down to the Périgord. Do you know where it is? It's southwest France, about an hour west of Bordeaux. Okay, it's a very rural area with foie gras and truffles and everything good to eat. But anyway, we get on that subject. But so we went down there and we went to the village where the real event happened. And we went to interview the mayor. And the mayor told us everything he knew. And what is interesting about the interview was at the end of it, and I was surprised he had been so frank, he said, well, let's just keep this among ourselves, which is very interesting because we are talking, 70 years after the war? What does that mean? It means that these things are so deep rooted and so taboo still that he didn't want us running out of the streets and telling everybody we met what he had just told us. I went back out in the streets and I didn't tell anybody anything, but I started asking questions. I saw a man come out of his house and I saw a lady sweeping in front of her house. And it was really interesting. I talked to my husband and I talked to the man and he asked us a few questions, mentioning a name of somebody. Did we know so-and-so? And we didn't. And then he went back in his house and we never saw him again. So we started thinking about what age he must have been when all this happened. And we figured he may even have been involved in what actually transpired. We never saw him again. The lady sweeping in front of her house, she knew all the people involved. But we went inside her house. We had a coffee and stayed for a long time. And she told us everything she knew too. We went to the archives in Périgueux, which is the regional capital down there in that particular region. We really covered a lot of territory. So that was what I call original research on the ground, because I also read a lot of books, of course, about this. And there are many books about this, in French especially, of course. So we did that. And I think you asked me did I discover anything unexpected?
Yes.
Yeah, I did. I did. That's all I can say.
Well, you've told us how much territory your research spanned, but also writing this book spanned a great deal of time too. So in this whole process, what was the hardest part of writing the book?
I had the feeling you were going to ask that question. So it's very funny because you know what was the hardest part? I mean, there were a few hard parts, but the hardest part is that I had never written fiction. Now, what do you do when you got a story and you don't have the technique to tell it? So I had to learn how to write fiction. So I I learned by writing this story. And that was very hard. Fortunately, I went to a few writing classes and things like that, but I picked up this book. Do you know this author, Elizabeth George? She's an American, but you would think she's English because she really knows England. It's incredible. And she wrote this book called Right Away. And there are zillions of books out there about how to write fiction, but this one really resonated with me. And she gave me such information, and I would read the book and then I would try her technique, and then I would do it, and it was wonderful. So I learned along with Elizabeth George about writing fiction. I learned how to create characters and give them name and birth dates and occupations. What did they do? That was a hard one for me. What did they do, these people? I had this huge Excel sheet to keep track of these people when they died and when they were born, etc. I learned to shut up and write. I once saw a writing class that was called Shut Up and Write, which I love because I was so excited about this book. And I was going around, people would say, oh, you're writing a book, what's it about? And I made the big mistake of telling people, and you should never do that. I wasted so much time, and I was so eloquent, and I could tell people just marvelous things about everything I was writing or going to write. I would go home, I'd forgotten everything I'd said. I had to start all over at zero because I was much better at voicing my ideas than putting them down on the paper. So I have this big sign, shut up and write, in my office. Just get to it, so that was one thing. Guilt was another thing because I had felt like I was stealing somebody's story and the person's life. And that was very heavy. It weighed very heavily on me, so much that it took me a very long time to write because I did feel that way sincerely. And I have since read that many authors do when they are dealing with someone who lived. Now, of course, I didn't steal this person's life because I didn't know this person. And there was nothing, I didn't tell my mother-in-law I was writing about her either. And I was thinking I couldn't ask for permission because then I would never write it. So I just went ahead and wrote it. Oh, and was there something else? Just a minute. No, that was it. Sorry.
Okay. My last question for you before I turn it over to everyone in the audience is, this book is so weighty, so many lessons, but what is the one thing you would really like for readers to take away from this book?
I would like the reader to take away the following, which I've written for you. If there is a lesson of the past not to repeat, it is to never give in to vigilante justice and crowd rule. In the words of the famous French writer, François Mauriac, revenge disguised as justice is our most horrendous grimace. That's what I'd like people to take away from the book after they've read it.
I'll type that in the chat for everyone as well.
So thank you. Okay, good.
Well, thank you for all of this, Harriet. We do have some amazing questions in the chat that I can't wait to ask you. Is our most horrendous grimace? We have some very active listeners, some questions, one I've never even asked you before. We have from Mr. Chuck Offenberger. He says, in your years as a working reporter, what were a couple of your biggest stories?
Ah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I went down to Lascaux, the prehistoric caves, when it was being closed. It had been closed because so many visitors had come to it that it was starting to ruin the, I was going to say the hieroglyphics, the sketches on the walls. And they were building the new Lascaux cave, the one that it's right next to it, and everybody can go to it because it's a replica of it. So that was one of the really fabulous stories that I had going down there to interview the people who were reproducing exactly the same colors that they'd used in prehistoric times to decorate the walls. That was a great story. I was doing a lot of cultural stories those days, and I did one. The Pi Pyramid was very controversial. do you remember probably many years ago when they decided to build that pyramid in the middle of the courtyard of the Louvre? That was very controversial, and many people just hated the idea of some modern edifice being set up right there in the courtyard. So I got to interview people, including the Minister of Culture, on that subject. He was very for it, by the way. So that was an interesting story. And I don't know. I had so many interesting stories. Those two pop, I think, until later.
We've got it. Well, those are very interesting. That could be another book for another time.
Yeah.
Our next question from Mrs. Gail Young, she says, oh, I like this. The mayor in Perigord, who is very hush-hush, says,
Yes.
Did you send the mayor a copy of your book?
Oh, Gail, what a question. That is a fabulous question. No, I did not. You know why? I didn't, because he doesn't speak English.
That's right.
And I didn't also because probably, I was going to say because I'm a big hypocrite. No, probably because he asked me not to tell anybody about this. And here I'm writing a book and I'm telling the entire world. So I think we'll just leave it, lay it to rest.
Okay. Well, Mr. Offenberger has another great question.
Okay.
Says, can you talk a minute about how you think France has changed from the World War II years to 1973 when you arrived and then to today?
Oh, well, I can. Do you have a few hours? Okay, I'll try to make it.
You have a few hundred pages?
Wow. Okay, I'm going to give you a practical example. When I first came, I call it the Hamburger Story, and I tell it in French toast. One day I just said, this is 1973, okay? So my mother-in-law and I were very, very complicitous. And so I went to her and I said, I want to make a hamburger today for you all. And she said, what is a hamburger? And I said, it's like a biftek haché. It's like a, it's like ground meat. And then you put it in a bun, and then you put in ketchup and whatever else you want to put. And she said, oh, well, that sounds interesting. She was always game for whatever I wanted to do. And so we made our hamburgers. We had to have somebody make the buns. Can you believe it? They didn't have hamburger buns in those days. And so we made them, and we went in and we put it on the table in front of my father-in-law. And he said, oh, he said, well, how do you eat this? And we said, well, you could just put it in your hands. He was horrified. And he said, well, why don't we just throw bones over our shoulders while we're at it? He just thought it was so barbaric. He couldn't believe it. And now, Skip, let's go on to, like modern days. Like now, are you kidding? There are hamburger places all over the city. The French have, become hamburger happy. So I am privileged to say that I knew a time when nobody knew what a hamburger was. Hamburger was hamburger. So that's one example. What else? Oh, there's so many examples. French women weren't walking around in tennis shoes like they do now. People weren't walking around dressed sloppily the way they are now with baseball caps and, all this stuff. There wasn't graffiti in the streets the way there is now. I mean, I could go on and on and on how France has changed. A lot of things, of course, are for the better. So I shouldn't be so sounding like I'm griping and grumbling. The streets are cleaner. They've cleaned the buildings up. Madame Hidalgo now, she's on a green kick. So we're getting a lot of more plants and green spaces, things like that. So, it's changed a lot. I might have to write a new book about that. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you've got your next book, French Future or something.
Yeah.
Oh, this is nice. Miss Patty Williams wants to know, is there a connection between your mother-in-law and Caroline?
Oh, between my mother-in-law and Caroline.
Yes.
Yes, I would say so.
Okay.
The whole thing about sister, I'll answer just a little bit, more elaborate. I was very interested in the whole thing about sisters, older sister, younger sister. I have this theory about, well, I'm the younger sister in my family, so I know all about older sisters. And so I thought Carolyn was a little bit like my mother-in-law and like my sister too, as a matter of fact. Very serious and loving the little sister, but always worried for her, etc. I mean, that, yeah, definitely, that was part of it. Because the little sister does really nutty, crazy things and is not like the big sister kind of thing. Yeah.
She moves to Paris on a freighter.
Yeah, things like that.
Mrs. Belling wants to know, do you plan to write another novel?
I would love to. I would hope that a subject would land in my lap like this one did. So it's all in getting, it's just kind of like, I'm not saying you stand around and wait for inspiration, but because afterwards it's all hard work. But it's true that if you don't love your idea, and if you're not obsessed by it, it's not worth writing it. So I'm waiting for the thing to come along that's going to obsess me.
Interesting. Well, here's a question that we normally ask, but we didn't get to today. Now that the book is in print and it's becoming kind of popular, what do Philippe and the Rocheforts think of the novel?
My in-law, I'm sorry to say that my in-laws, it took me so long to write the book that they have since passed away. And in any case, I wouldn't have published the book had they been alive, because I didn't feel that I could. So, and I did I had Philippe call up my sister-in-law and tell her, and she said, oh, well, that's fine. And then I had him call up the other very, very close relative who even bears the name of the real person, that close. And he told her too. And I was really worried about that one. And she said, oh, that's fine. Because for her, I knew she thought this way because we discussed it one day about something else. And she said, well, why do people always bring up the past? It's just better to bury it. So fortunately, she was consistent and it wasn't a problem for her. Also, I must say that they don't speak English.
Okay.
But even if they did, the stories changed so substantially that it wouldn't be a problem.
Interesting. Well, another interesting question that we've actually never had before. Is it possible to purchase the book autographed in the US? It's something to think about.
You can buy the book in the US, and I can send you what is called a book plate. In other words, it's kind of like a label. Like when you make food, you're going to freeze it. And you mark what it is. Well, you can do that for books. So there are these little book plates, and I write on the book plate, and then you can put it in the front cover of the book, like so. Very clever. So, and if anybody wants to do that, they just email me with their name and their address, and I will do it with great pleasure. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, I'll put Harriet's information as well in the chat.
Okay.
Miss Shatina wants to know, how did you know to start your research in Perigord, and did some of the family give you clues on where to start?
Oh, yes, absolutely. My mother-in-law told me many, many stories about her childhood in this little town. And that's ever since I joined the family. I was fascinated by her stories because she actually grew up in a chateau. And her parents weren't caretakers of that chateau, but they were in a humble position like the parents of Séverine. Mm-hmm. There was no benevolent queen, no countess in that chateau, but you see, you put things together. So yes, so I knew exactly where to go. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And Linda would like to know, what do you think about the increasing use of English words spoken in French? Oh,
I hate it. I hate it because I think French is a beautiful language, and I think it's a snobby kind of thing. If you stick in an English word in a sentence, it makes you look like you know something. So, but it's gone a little bit too far, I think. Sometimes I'll read magazines and every other word will be in English. It's kind of depressing, but it's just such a beautiful language. I don't know why the French don't. I don't know. I don't understand.
I've met many French people who are very mad at us Americans for bringing our language into theirs.
Well, I'm kind of mad at the French because they don't have to take it either. I mean, nobody's got a gun there.
That is very true. Greg Bunce would like to know more about the process of fictionalizing a true story.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your sentence.
Greg Bunce would like you to talk more about the process of fictionalizing a true story.
Right. Greg Bunce is a fellow Iowan. I don't see him here. Yeah. Oh, hi, Greg. Yeah, and hi, Chuck. I've got 2 Iowans here. These are people that I grew up with or near. The process of fictionalizing
A true story.
a true story. It's fascinating because it's a kind of a choosing this, eliminating that. Because if I told you the true story of what really happened down there, you would be very interested to see that I took out some key people and I moved in some other people who became key. It's a question of how you feel about your characters and how the book is moving. Because I didn't want to stick too closely to the true story. It was going to become much too complicated. So I took people who were emblematic of what they represented. And then I made them up. So they were doing what those other people had done, but I didn't put those specific people in the story.
Okay. And Betty would like to know something we often get asked. Will the book be translated into French?
That's a good question. Frankly, I don't know. I never wanted my books to be translated into French because I wrote them for English speakers, for an English-speaking audience. That was true of French Toast. It wasn't translated for a long time, and I was the one who translated it with a French woman I know. We did it together. So I don't know about this book, but recently I read a book in French about an aspect of the war at the same period of time. It was fascinating. It was so well done, and really I felt like I was so attuned to this woman and the story that she told that I was saying, well, maybe my story should be in French too. Yeah. So we'll see.
Yes, stay tuned for that, folks.
Stay tuned. Yeah.
2 pretty funny comments in a row about your hamburger anecdote. Gwen Ellen says that in France, she shared hamburgers and potato salad at a party in the early 70s, and it was quite an event that would happen in France in the 70s.
Oh, absolutely.
And to show how much it's changed, Susan says, now there's a vegan hamburger place in Paris.
Oh yeah, it's changed a lot. I mean, it's just amazing. I'm happy I was here that early on to see the changes.
Yes, I mean, I wish I saw pre-hamburgers. There are about 5 outside my door. Valerie would like to know, being married to a Frenchman, and might I add, the most fabulous Frenchman, Philippe Rochefort.
Thank you.
She says, what is the working language of your marriage, French or English?
Well, in the beginning, it was English because my husband speaks very good English and my French wasn't that good. But as time went on, we were with his family a lot, and I just felt it was so impolite to speak English while everybody else was speaking French and making them translate for me. Anyway, they didn't speak English, so I just learned French, and I had the most lovely in-laws, and my mother-in-law would correct me, but not all the time. Just if I said something really that would be shocking or embarrassing or out of place, yes, then she would. But or if it was a verb that was completely way off. But I learned so much from her because of her. She spoke beautiful French, and I learned just so much from her and the way that she approached speaking French with me. I think I was very fortunate. And so now we speak both, and our children speak both, and our grandchildren do not speak both because I think I don't know. Sometimes I say to my kids, I say, who do you think is going to teach your kids to speak English if you don't? And they say, well, they can speak it with you. And I say, no, they cannot. I spoke English with you from day one, and it's in your head because of me, but it won't be in their heads because of you. You're not doing it. So I'll just leave them alone and they'll work it out.
Well, we'll see about that. We have 2 more questions left that are pretty good. Ms. Gail Young would also like to know, what is your writing routine? Do you even have a writing routine, like specific time of the day, or do you outline?
I go on kicks. That's to say, I can take a week off and be depressed and do nothing and think I'm the world's biggest failure and I might as well just give all this up. And then I get all my energy back and I can just do it day and night for 10 days. So I'm very up and down kind of person. I'm not this regular person who goes in the office every day kind of thing. No, it's just, I know it's not good, but that's the way it is for me.
And last but not least, your friend, Chuck Offenberger, who has seen you since the Iowa days, he says, don't forget to tell the story about how you got to France.
Oh, the story about how I got to France. Okay. How much time do I have left? 4 minutes? 3? 4 minutes? Okay. Okay. I'll try to make a long story short. As I said, from the time I was 8, I wanted to go to France. And when I graduated from the University of Michigan, everybody said, what are you going to do? Are you going to go to grad school? Are you going to get a job? What? And I said, I held up my hand with a one-way ticket to France. And I said, that's what I'm doing. I'm leaving tomorrow. I've got a one-way ticket. What? And so, and where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to live in this pension de famille with this nice family and some French students. And then we'll see. So that's what I did. And I lived in this pension de famille. And we had the best time. It was all students my age, but they were all French. So once again, I put myself in a situation where I'm really stupid because my French was not that good, but I learned a lot. And I'll never forget when I arrived at the airport, the father of the family, who was so typically French looking, oh my God, just amazing. And he was in his Dishevaux, he was in his Dishevaux, that kind of sardine can car. And I had rehearsed on the plane. I said, what is he going to ask me? And I know he's going to ask me if I had a good flight. And so I had rehearsed a phrase and I said, oui, très bien, calme et tout. And so he was convinced I spoke French. And he spoke French to me all the way back to the house. And I'd also learned something else. I don't know where I picked it up, but I observed that French people often stop in the middle of a sentence and they will go, ah bon? Like, oh, really? Ah bon? And so every time he would take a breath, I would go, ah bon? And I didn't know what he was saying. I would go, ah bon? And I looked very interested. So we got all the way back to the house. And then it kind of started falling apart. And they realized, but nobody spoke English anyway, so it didn't make any difference. So we did that. And I stayed there for a year and I found jobs because at that time you could find jobs in France so easily. It was just amazing. And then the May 68 riots came and I was the last person out of there after having had tear gas in my face. And then I went out and then I went to the Medill School of Journalism and then I graduated. And one more time, everybody said, what are you going to do? Are you going to do this? You're going to do that? And I said, well, and that time I got on a freighter and I went down the coast of California, ended up in Acapulco, hung around Mexico for a while, went over to Veracruz, got on a freighter in Veracruz. The freighter took me to Colombia, to the Canary Islands, to Cadiz in Spain, got off in Cadiz, went to Morocco, got back to Spain, took a train all the way up to Paris, took one look at Paris and said, been there, done that, I'm going to Argentina. And the next night, mutual friends said, listen, before you leave, could you just come along? I'd like you to meet a friend of mine before you go. And I said, oh, sure, why not? So I go to the Le Select, the Select, that wonderful cafe in Montparnasse where all the American writers and all the French artists hung out. So I go to the Select and it's a beautiful summer day. And and my friend introduces me to this handsome gentleman sitting there, nice looking. And so I sit down and we start talking and my friend disappears. And I'm left alone with this guy. And the guy was good looking, but he had this expression on his face. I think that you can gather from having listened to me tonight that I love to laugh. I probably laugh too much, maybe a nervous laughter or something, but I love to laugh and I love to smile. And this guy is sitting there and he has this expression on his face, which is totally no smile, nothing. And I said, oh, I'm going to give this 10 minutes and I'm out of here. This is just not my thing. So we started talking. And what happened was he starts talking and he is telling me this stuff that is so funny with this expression that is totally deadpan. And I am cracking up. And I came back for more and more. I just thought he was so unusual and so funny. And I canceled my trip to Argentina and I stayed and we got married. And here we are, 3 kids later and almost 7 grandchildren. One's on the way. And that was I never got to Argentina, by the way.
You never got to Argentina, but you got Philippe Rochefort and we got you here, which is what we can all be thankful for.
So that's kind of a long story and I didn't even tell half of it.
Well, thank you for telling us that story and thank you for telling us everything tonight. It was really amazing. And thank you to all of you for coming. I think the people from the Alliance Française might have a closing word.
So everyone, to Harriet and Maggie, thank you so much. This has been enlightening. It's a courageous story of Harriet coming to France. It's a courageous book. It is, for those of you that have not read it, it is edge of your seat in the conclusion. And as I've said to Harriet myself, I don't care if this book comes out in French. I'd like to see it as a film. And so I'm going to talk to Harriet more about that. It's a very visual book. You are there with these characters, and it would really, I think it would be a very interesting film. But on the part of the AFUSA network, we're thrilled. I think we had close to 80 people on this Zoom event. And Harriet, you've been so engaging, and we look forward to your next book or next opportunity to share l'écran with you. So.
Oh, well, thank you.
Again.
Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed your questions and seeing you. And maybe we'll see you again for some other occasion then.
Hope so. Hope to see you in Paris someday.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.